Okay, let's start sewing. So the first thing we're going to do is disassemble our paper mock-up, and we're going to use it as a pattern. When you lay your pieces out on your fabric, you want to leave about a 1/4 inch all the way around for what's called a seam allowance, so that when you sew, you have a little bit extra to sew into when you turn it inside out, or when you fold the edges over to make it look neater. Then you cut it out. I want my edges to look nice and neat, so I'm going to fold them over, and I want them to stay that way. So I broke out the ironing board and my iron, and I'm going to iron those edges over so they stay folded when I sew them. Now you can use an ironing board, or you can even just use a towel on the ground. That's fine. Just make sure that you're very careful with that iron. It gets hot. Don't burn yourself. Now it's time to get sewing. So we're going to pull some thread off, and we're going to thread the needle. Now, when your eyes are as old as mine, this might be the hardest part. So it's going to take me a second here. Every now and then I'll lick the end of the thread, see if that can't make it a little sharper, and it still takes me a little bit of time. But eventually, I get it. Now, my mom taught me to double the thread over, so you're going to pull the thread through the eye of the needle, and we need to tie a knot at the bottom. So she told me to wrap the thread around my finger and then roll it off and pull it down. And when you pull it, it makes a knot. Sometimes it takes a couple times, or 3 times. But eventually, it'll make a knot, or you can just tie a knot in the bottom. That's totally fine too. And now, we're going to start sewing. I always put my thread through on the inside of a seam, so I put it on the inside of where it was folded over, and I push it through one side and out the top and back and forth. And once I do that a few times, I pull it through. I kind of think of it like an inchworm. I put it through and then back and forth, and then pull it through. You want to make sure that you're not pulling the fabric too tight so it bunches up. And then you do that all the way down your seam. Now the smaller your stitches are, the stronger your seam is going to be. So try to make them even and try to make them small. As you do more stitches, you're going to get more practice, and it's going to get easier and easier. Now, some of my stitches are better than others, but the smaller and more even they are, the better they're going to be. And you can see at the end, my stitches were pretty good, but I have a couple really big ones in there. And if yours start looking like the big one, don't worry, you can always redo it. Now we need to tie a knot in the end. So what I do is I make a loop, and then I pull the needle through the loop before I pull it tight, and then pull it tight, and you're ready to cut your thread, and your seam is done. Now we're going to sew the rest of it up just like we did on that first seam. If yours is in a couple different pieces, or you have some parts to sew like I do that's going to conform it to your face, you want to make sure that you're sewing on the right side. We want the seam to be on the inside of the mask. So I made sure that the other seams were on the inside of the mask so that it would hide it. And then you do it exactly the same as you did before. Just make sure that you're sewing about a 1/4 inch in for that seam allowance. Once you get to the end of your seam, you're going to tie a knot, cut off your thread, and then flip it inside out. I'm going to use fabric for my straps, so I'm going to cut out an edge, and then I want to iron it over. That's just going to make it look a little bit neater. And then I'm going to use my mock-up to know how big it's supposed to be, and I'm going to run a seam right down the middle of that just to keep it folded over and make sure it's looking nice and neat. Now that I have my straps made, I'm going to attach them to my mask. So this time when I sew it, I'm not going to use the inchworm technique. I'm just going to go in and out. That's going to make my stitches a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to run a stitch up, and then I'm going to run a stitch down. That way it's going to be as strong as I can make it. And I'm going to do that for both sides of the strap and make it as strong as I possibly can, because that's going to take the most wear and tear on your mask. Now it's time for the fun part, the mustache. I'm going to use my pattern and I'm going to draw it out, and I want to make sure I have a generous seam allowance. Cut it bigger than you think you need to, so when you stitch it together it's the right size. Now you notice I'm using a white colored pencil because I just happen to have one, but as long as you can see it, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that we could see it for the video. And then take your time cutting out both sides. Now I'm going to stuff this with a little bit of stuffing so it has dimension, and that's why I'm making two. So it's going to be like a mustache stuffy. Now that I have both sides of my mustache cut out, time to stitch them together. So I'm going to load up my needle with thread again, and I'm going to start stitching all the way around. Now the difference with this is I'm going to leave a little bit of an opening. That way I can put stuffing in it to give it some dimension. But other than that, it's exactly the same as I did for the mask. And this time I'm going to use the inchworm technique and make sure that my stitches are as small and strong as I can make them. Once I get it all stitched up, I'm going to turn it inside out. That'll keep all those seams on the inside and make the outside look nice and neat. Now I'm going to use a pencil just to make sure those corners are sharp. But I need to start thinking about where I can get some stuffing. Oh, there's some. Now when I put the stuffing in, I'm going to tear it off into little pieces just to make sure that I can get it as far down as possible and it doesn't look lumpy. Once I get it all stuffed, then it's time to sew everything closed. And this time, you're not going to be able to hide the seams, so you want to make sure that your stitches are as small as possible, just so that they look nice and neat. And really take your time on this. Okay, now it's time to attach the mustache to the mask. So I'm going to sew just on the back part of the mustache so that no one sees it. And I'm just sewing a square right in the middle, just to make sure that it's nice and strong. And there we go. There's my Mr. Marco mustache mask. I'm really excited to see what you guys make.